Hello, this is Charles Brewer, president of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program on July 28, 2023. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Charles Brewer, president of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods. Thank you for making time in your day to learn something new, and I think today will be an especially informative time for you. Before we begin, a few housekeeping types of things. On the table up here, there are two things. In case you've never gotten a copy, or else in case you want to get a copy for a new neighbor or something like that, we have this trifold brochure with links to images of the various historical markers that we've put around the Lake of the Woods over the last 11 years. So come up and grab one if you want to. And if you're particularly rated in support of our group, we have bumper stickers, a few here. So, and most of you are here because you received an email from us, or you're already on our email list, or you saw it in the Lake Currents or Helen Zirkle's email distribution list. And I thank you for that, Alan. You've always been very supportive in that respect. But if you want to be on our contact list, we're going to pass this around. There's actually a pen. Give us your name, your email address, and your phone number. If you think that your email address has changed, as it sometimes do, fortunately we're in a place now where we get maybe one kickback every time I send something out, and then I just delete that person unless they ask for it again. So we're going to start doing this again at each meeting. So Boggs, will you start it around? We have your email address. So at any rate, can I ask, we have several board members here. I'm standing up, so I don't have to stand up myself, but if you can stand up, Boggs, Greg, Deke, and so we have about 7 others as well. Tom is here. Sorry about that. Yeah, really. So if you have any ideas for speakers for our 2024 season, please let myself or any of these fine people know. If you have any ideas for things that we can do, projects, please bring them to us, and of course be ready to volunteer your knowledge and also maybe your time, because everybody working together makes for better projects. Please visit our website, civilwarstudygroup.org, to see the specifics of our upcoming programs. Our next program will be in this space on Friday, August 25th, starting at 10:30 a.m. as usual. Our speaker will be our Vice President, Mr. Jack Finn, whose subject will be Dissecting the Battle in the Wilderness, the 1866 photographic odyssey of Surgeon General Reed. So that's interesting. So please come. Lots of visuals, I would expect. So our speaker today is Dr. Daryl Black. He's a longtime student of the Civil War. He earned his PhD from the University of California, Irvine in 2001. Since then, he has taught at the University of California, Irvine, Auburn University, which is what, Alabama? Right? Yeah. So he's been moving east all these years. And the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Though trained as an academic, Daryl's heart is in public history. He has led museum projects in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and most recently at Seminary Ridge Museum, Gettysburg, where he resides, by the way, not in the museum, but in Gettysburg. Over the course of his career, he has published essays on topics including memory and the American Revolution, revivalism in Antebellum, Georgia, and souvenirs at the dedication of the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. His current research project focuses on the ways that antebellum religious practices shaped the wartime revivals in the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Daryl is currently one of the Copie Hill Civil War Fellows at the American Battlefield Trust. But enough from me. Please welcome our speaker, Dr. Daryl Black.
Is everybody able to hear me pretty well? Okay, good. It's been a while since I've been out in public to talk. Gary's had me in my basement writing and doing research for the last 3 years, so this is the first time that I've been out since the pandemic. So if I stumble a little bit, please forgive me. I'm a little rusty, but I think I'll do okay. And I'm talking about a project that I've been working on since I started my graduate work in 1994 at Cal State University, Long Beach. Thinking about American religion and how American religion affected the Civil War generation, and how the specifics of Southern expressions of evangelical religion shaped the ways that people approached the oncoming war in the 1850s, and then shaped the ways that people experienced the war both at the home front and on the battlefield. One of the things that I've discovered over the course of the last 10 or so years is that there's a conversation that's going on between the home front and the battlefield through religion. Remember, these chaplains oftentimes go home, they take things home, they bring things back. The letters that are being written by soldiers in Lee's army are full of religious references. They're full of statements of prayer and support both ways. So this is a conversation, that this is one way to link, religion is one way to link the home front to the battlefield. These are traditions that these young men had grown up in. And the men who make up Robert E. Lee's army are from a very specific part of the world, and that's very important to think about when we talk about the religious background and then the religious expressions during the war that we see being practiced in Robert E. Lee's army. Also, in case I forget it once we get there, a lot of what I'm talking about as far as the religious revivals in the camps happened within, 10, 15 miles of where we're standing at the winter camps in Fredericksburg and Orange Courthouse. So we're very close to where these revivals took place. And it's just another layer of our understanding of this place that I think is very important. So, when I started this project, when I started thinking about how to get into thinking about Civil War history and thinking about the cultural history of the American Civil War, I decided that I would start at the American Revolution and come forward. That I would understand how the church developed in the Deep South, especially in the plantation districts, because we know that Joe Gladhart has shown us very clearly, and I'll show you some more evidence here in just a minute, that the soldiers in Robert E. Lee's army come from the plantation districts. There's no doubt about that. The evidence is absolutely crystal clear. So when we think about what revival looked like in Lee's army, and what religious conversations looked like, and what private piety looked like, we have to look to the churches that existed in these antebellum plantation districts to understand the ideas that these men brought into the army with them. These things change, and that's important to think about, but we'll think about that at the end of this talk. Antebellum Southern religion is really complicated. The hardest chapter of the book project that I'm working on right now is compressing 120 years of antebellum religious from the late colonial period through the war to the beginning of the war, compressing that into 40 pages. So it's a very complicated topic, but there's some major themes that I think that are important to think about. First off, you'll see Silas Mercer in millennialism. This is the idea that God's kingdom is coming to earth. Millennialism is a very important way of thinking about religion in 19th century America. There's a northern version and there's a southern version. And Mercer begins to write about the southern version of millennialism at the end of the American Revolution. And not to belabor the point, but Mercer's idea is a very conservative one. It's also a very nationalistic one. He writes an essay in 1785, publishes an essay called Tyranny Exposed and True Religion Discovered, wherein is contained the scripture doctrine concerning kings, their rise, reign, and downfall. Any of y'all historians of the English Revolution? If you are, you know about the monarchy men, some of the most extreme advocates of Cromwell's reign. Reading Mercer's book or reading Mercer's essay is almost like reading a monarchy men tract. He says there are multiple dispensations where kings have rule over people, and God in his wisdom destroys those in succession. In the American Revolution, in Mercer's story, in Mercer's version of this, not Cromwell, but the American Revolution had finally brought God's right form of government to the world. It's a very popular text. It circulates all through the southern colony, or through the southern states in the years after the American Revolution. Second major theme, social hierarchy. We think of Baptists as being very democratic. We think of Methodism as being very democratic and people-oriented and people-powered. Well, that's partly true. There is especially amongst the Baptists, there is a democratic ecclesiology. So you get to make the decisions in the church. There's not a bishop in a church hierarchy, a formal church hierarchy. So it's very democratic in that way. But they believe in a social hierarchy. They believe that some people are better than others, and they are absolutely turned inside out by the changes that are happening in the late 18th century related to the French Revolution specifically. They say that Henry Holcomb publishes a short-lived newspaper in Georgia in 1801, 1803. Writes all about this, but one of his my favorite quote that kind of sums up Holcomb and the Georgia Baptist view on this is that the revolutions have inspired the refuse of society to rise to the top and to treat their betters with insolence. That the fallacious orators of the age of reason have put things upside down. That there's a natural, God-ordained hierarchy that functions in the world, and we have to pay attention to that. And as this is developing, remember, this is in Augusta, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia. What's happening at the same time in that area? Short staple cotton agriculture is becoming the dominant mode of production, the way that people make money. Eli Whitney invents his cotton gin within the region that these preachers are preaching and teaching. And this is where the Old South develops. This is where, when we think of Gone with the Wind and short staple cotton agriculture, this is where it's invented. The Old South is not that old. The Old South is 1801, 1802. So these ideas are developing right in tandem with that economic change that's going on in the upcountry of Georgia. Last thing, revivalism. Usually when we think of revivals, this is key to what happens in the camps. Okay? This is key to what happens through the 19th century. A lot of times when we think of revivalism, we think of people shouting and having the jerks and falling down on the ground. We think of Cane Ridge. We think of these emotional excesses. We think of searing immediate conversions. And that doesn't work for the Baptists. The Baptists are Calvinists. These Baptists are Calvinists. And they think that conversion happens over time. It takes a long time to become knowledgeable of your sinful state, and then that God has chosen you for salvation. It's a long, slow process. Jesse Mercer articulates that very well in the 1820s. He's a prolific writer, the namesake of Mercer University in Georgia, the real leader of the Baptist denomination in Georgia and across the Deep South. He trains many ministers, etc., etc. His idea of revivalism was to strike people with the profoundest silence. He wanted to effect an introspective mode within his preaching that would allow people then to begin to think about what their spiritual path might be. There wasn't shouting. There wasn't excessive emotional outburst. It was a quiet, introspective, long experience. And it took the right people to lead people through those experiences. The most important thing, though, that we have to think about that overarches everything, the millennialism, the social hierarchy, the revivalism, is a pro-slavery theology that begins to develop in the late 18th century It says basically God has ordained slavery as the right social system for the world. The Bible says it. There are multiple places in the Bible that support this view. And if you read the Bible literally, you have to conclude that slavery is okay, that slavery is the right system. This becomes increasingly well articulated by the wartime period. We see it in the sermons we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But it really takes hold by the 1840s. The 1830s and 40s, late 1820s through the early 1840s is really the period in which religion becomes dominant in the South. Usually we think of the South as the most religious part of the country. That's not so until the 1820s or 30s. The Congregational churches in New England, the Methodist churches in New England and the Middle Atlantic states were the more religious parts of the country from the Revolution to the early 1830s or so. Big revivals happened in 1828, 29, 30 in Georgia, South Carolina. Those are then transferred into Alabama, Mississippi territory as these people begin to move from east to west. Preached widely, taught in schools, taught in sermons, published in books and pamphlet forms. This document here, The Defense of the South, is something that I actually own. I own 4 pieces of 19th century religious literature, and 2 of them are by Iveson Brooks, who's one of these, everyday kind of proponents of the pro-slavery theology. This is published in Hamburg, South Carolina, right across the Savannah River from Augusta, right in the center of where that old cotton, that short staple cotton agriculture develops. And it goes through, and it says, the Bible says it's right, and here's the places in the Bible that says it's right, and you need to believe that it's right. So those are the big themes in Southern religion. Now, this is an important map. I'm sure some of you have seen it, and it was produced in 1860. It's based on the 1860 census. It was done by the U.S. Coast Survey, and it shows the counties shows the concentration of enslavement in every county in the United States. It's trying to help people understand how the politics are developing. And this would be a very popular internet meme if this were today. Easy. The darker the shade, the higher the concentration of enslaved persons in the counties.
Excuse me, what year was that?
1860. It's based on the 1860 census, and it is published widely at the time. So, when we think of Robert E. Lee's army, we got to think about where they came from. And the short story is they came from those counties that were the darkest on the map. These were the men who joined the armies first. They come to Virginia, and they serve in Lee's army, and they form the backbone of the army. I wanted to throw this in just for a second, just to disabuse us of this idea of Southern religion as being sort of primitive, sort of backwards, sort of backwoods preachers, log cabin churches. These are antebellum churches. I think all of them still stand today. Mobile, Alabama, the outskirts of Augusta, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina. That is in Henry County, Georgia, I believe. This is in South Central Alabama, and this is in Richmond, Virginia. The church architecture tells us something about the wealth and the station of religion in the South. These are not inexpensive places of worship, and 3 of these are in small rural communities. So we're not thinking of log cabin churches. We're not thinking of Shiloh Church in Tennessee, right? We've all seen the pictures of Shiloh Church. It's a log cabin. It's a very humble structure. These are not humble structures. And I could put up 70, 80, 100 pictures just like this from all across the areas where Robert E. Lee's army came from. Now, not going to go too far into this, but we do need to think about the evidence. Like I said, Joe Gladhar has told us already that Lee's army was predominantly from the slaveholding districts. And he did a sample about 20 years ago in his book on Lee's army. And his sample was good, his sample's fine. I'm a little nitpicky, and I want to know exactly. So what I did is I found out the county of origin for every company from every regiment in Robert E. Lee's Army. And then I took that 1860 map, and I took the concentrations of slavery, or enslaved persons within those counties, put it in a big spreadsheet, and then made some tables. And you can see on the left-hand side, I'm just a little bit small, but you can see here, I've gone the wrong way. Well, it doesn't matter because I didn't want to dwell on this for too awfully long. And it's kind of funny, we got to North Carolina, an outlier. Let's go back. Tennessee's an outlier. South Carolina, how about that? Okay, let's see if I push the right button. You can see this column here. This column in every one of these charts shows the percentage of enslaved persons in the counties that sent companies to Robert E. Lee's Army. That means in the case of South Carolina, 70% of the companies, over 70% of the companies, came from counties that had an enslaved population of over 45%. We can do this for every single county in Robert E. Lee's Army with the data set that I set up here. So these aren't generalizations. These aren't my statements about places of origin are not based on sample sizes. They're based on actual count. Every single county, every single regiment in Robert E. Lee's Army is included in this data set. So I think I've got a copy of it with me.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, can you read the legend at the bottom? I can't quite make out.
Yeah. There are two more columns that I don't want to get too far into because so this is a percentage of total enslaved. This is percentage, and so then what I did is I took the 1860 census and they made there was a separate schedule, not just a population schedule. They had multiple schedules of the census. They counted in 1860 the number of seats for each church in each county. And so I used that as shorthand for affiliation in the dominance of each denomination in each county. And then aggregated that. And that then shows the percentage of Baptists within these counties, the percentage of Methodists within these counties. And unless I make a note, like I do here, you're looking at Baptist and Methodist. Baptist and Methodist predominate. North Carolina is an outlier state. They send a lot of soldiers to the Army. They have a big influence in the Army. Same in Virginia. But you'll notice that this column and this column add up to about, when you go through the whole set of data, about 70% of the counties had 30% and above enslaved populations. It's the heart of the slaveholding South. And that's where Lee's Army is from.
Daryl,
Yes.
the previous one, it's actually here too.
Yeah.
No Baptists in the 16 to 32% category?
That's what's showing, yes.
Really?
Yeah. Methodists and Presbyterians, you can see the percentage of Methodism is way off the chart here. There are interesting questions that come up out of this, the generalization, but that really gets into the weeds of something that I'm going to do in the book study is think about the tone of each of these regiments and these places based on the denominational affiliation. But that's way far into the weeds at this point. Yes, sir.
This might sound like a silly question.
No, they're not.
But it's not. How do you actually tell what religion a person is?
How do you tell? First off, you can look at the denominational records. They're very good. They're very thorough. The Georgia Baptist Convention, the Southern Baptist Convention after 1845 they have annual meetings. The same for the Methodists, the same for Presbyterians, and they have annual charts of how many members they have in each denomination. So we can use those denominational records to tell that. Then we can drop into state level records association level and conference levels, the multiple conferences within a state of Methodism, associations amongst the Baptists. And we can see where the concentrations are. We can see where the rises and falls in membership come from. So we can see very clearly what those patterns look like. When we get into the letters, the people are not very shy about saying what they are. They're very proud of their denominational affiliations in the 19th century. So we have a lot of empirical evidence, and then we have the evidence that comes from the letters. So Virginia, let's move through this. I've not intended to spend a lot of time here, but this is obviously interesting stuff. Louisiana is an outlier. Lots of Catholics in Louisiana, not surprisingly. But again, you see the high concentrations of counties in which enslaved persons count for over 30% of the population. Mississippi, not surprising. So, all this said, you would think that it would be an easy transition from peacetime to wartime as far as religion is concerned. But it's not so easy. And both the lay people and the denominational leaderships have to adapt to the demands of secession and war, just like the economy has to be shifted, just like the government has to be created from new. 1861, 1862 is a hard time in organizing and taking and translating that antebellum experience to the wartime. So they're adapting. You've got preaching. So there are two really big forms of preaching and sermons that you see, and there are hundreds of public, 200 or so sermons that are given that I've identified from the early war period. I've read about 60 of them at this point. And they're falling into two camps. One is preaching to encourage the new recruits, and the other is to explain why God let the war happen. Because war is a terrible thing, according to the Bible. So these ministers have to shift their emphasis to explain why God let this war come. Okay, why He let it come? Yes, that's right. So, Shelton Sanford is a great example. He left a diary. He was a mathematics professor at Mercer College. The photograph is a modern photograph of the Penfield Baptist Church at the old Mercer site over near Union Point, Georgia. Penfield, Georgia, if you've ever been down there. I imagine I'm the only one. This is the Antebellum structure. This is where the faculty and students from Mercer College at the time went. It's the big Baptist university. It's where all the Baptist ministers who served in Southern Baptist Convention churches worship. And by the way, let's not forget, I left this out, 1844, the Methodists split over slavery. 1845, the Baptists split over slavery. The Southern Baptist Convention is the Baptist organization that comes out of that 1845 split. The same Southern Baptist Convention that we have today. Same publications, the Christian Index, all of the organization of the Southern Baptist Church comes out of that split in 1845. So Shelton Sanford is the mathematics professor there. He's also the Sunday school director. His wife is the Sunday school director for the young people who are members of this church. Sanford is very unhappy about secession. He writes extensively in his diary about how disappointed he is in what Georgia is doing. But, like so many others, as soon as the national allegiance changes, as soon as secession is accomplished, he becomes a Confederate. And within 3-4 weeks of writing, oh my gosh, I'm sitting in my house, I can hear the bells ringing and the cannons being fired in Greensboro. Georgia must have seceded. This is January 19th, 1861. He's very upset. It's a dreary, nasty day. He's sitting in the study and he's bemoaning the fact that Georgia has left the Union. Within 3 or 4 weeks, out in front of this church, he is leading drill sessions for the students at Mercer College who are organizing to go to war. His son ends up as a member of the 3rd or 8th Georgia Regiment. The record is kind of weird. The references are kind of weird in Sanford's diary. I haven't quite, come to a conclusion that he was in the 3rd or the 8th. If he was in the 3rd, he's in Ambrose Wright's brigade. If he's in the 8th, he's in Ty Anderson's brigade, both fighting brigades from Lee's army. The conversation back and forth between Sanford and his son is fascinating. Again, another subject for another day. The important thing to think about here is how quickly Sanford goes from being a Unionist to a Confederate, and his role in leading Sunday school, which is how people learn about the pro-slavery theology, how they learn about Baptist faith, how they learn about Calvinism as it's expressed through the Baptists. And that his wife is also a Sunday school leader is equally important and something that we'll get to in just a few minutes. Second thing that you see in the clergy's dealing with the war is, what are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to act in the war? And John Whiteman from Yorkville, South Carolina, I believe, not certain, but I believe he ends up later in the war as a chaplain, or at least a missionary who comes to the army some, because we see a lot of that. He writes that he gives a sermon on July 28th. It's a day of celebration and thanksgiving for the Confederate victory at the Battle of First Manassas. Sermons all over the country, celebrations all over the country, all over the Confederacy. And as part of this, I mean, the first part, the glory of God in defense of the South, it's all about pro-slavery. It's all about how God has ordained slavery as the just and best political system, and you see this over and over and over again. We're holding up the best Republican system for the world to see. We're fighting against the infidelism of the radical republicanism of the 1840s revolutions. And guess what? That red republicanism is right in the northern churches, right this second. And we are defending God's word, and we are defending true religion, and we're defending the true expression of republicanism in America. That's the main part of this sermon. But he starts this out. He said, what's our job? And he says, the office of a Christian minister is to preach repentance. So that's a major thing that we're going to see in these revivals in the armies, preaching repentance. That's the meat and taters of what these people are doing. But then he says, he has a divine warning and overshadowing the nation with the burden of prophecy. Even he who came to redeem paused on his mission to shed patriotic tears for Jerusalem. So the job of the minister is to preach repentance, but also to preach patriotism, and patriotism to the Confederate nation. Yeah, quickly.
Any coincidence that he issues this a few days after Manassas?
Oh, it's not a coincidence at all. I mean, it's absolutely planned. Right after the battle, Davis says, let's have a day of thanksgiving for this great victory. And so ministers across the South, and Davis does this a dozen times or so during the war, either Thanksgiving special days or fast days of repentance for our defeats, and to explain why why things are going badly. But it's important to note this, because this is something that this pattern of repentance and patriotism is something that you see, but Whiteman comes right out and says it. This is what we're supposed to do. Yes, sir, and then David.
In the movie Gods in General,
Yes.
General Jackson says, Lord, I don't want to fight this battle on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
That was quite an amazing scene. It was fought on Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah, and
I'm not saying God was in charge, but God
yeah, I mean, there are traditions that these people don't want to breach over the course of the war, but they're struggling with this. They struggle with the practical implications of what's going on, and the theoretical or spiritual or theological learning and teachings that they've grown up with. Very quickly.
Where I was going was with the idea that God's order is slavery.
Yeah.
And he hath smite the northerners totally unexpectedly in a great battle.
Yeah.
And here we are 2 days later saying, see, this is what it's really all
Yeah.
about. We are we are to win.
Yeah, and that's what Whiteman is saying, is that there are others that are saying the same thing. They say, look, we've won at Ball's Bluff, we won at Fort Sumter, we won at Springfield, Missouri, and now we've won at Gettysburg. Sorry, I live in Gettysburg, so that's always my default battle. We've won at Manassas, and that means that God is on our side. Yeah, absolutely. There are the other sermons that are being delivered in 1861 that are equally important. There are multiple examples of these send-off sermons where the soldiers are being encouraged to do their duty and to be good Christians in the army. Again, patriotism, repentance, salvation, all wrapped up together. But they This is for the Confederate cadets. They were organized in Petersburg. They become a part of the 41st Virginia Infantry, which puts them, I believe, in Brockenbrow's brigade. In any case, let's see, proclamation of the world ready to sacrifice the word of God rather than the principle of abolitionism. We need not wonder that among the masses, that word should fall into disrepute and contempt. The Bible would be overshadowed by abolitionism. We refuse to admit that principle, and in resulting, its enforceable intrusions upon us. They're accusing the northern ministers of putting this false prophecy in front of the people, this false reading of the Bible. We're refusing to surrender the principle of revelation for the falsehood and deceit of a vain philosophy, which is abolitionism. This is just one of them. This is what soldiers are being sent off to war to do. This is what their leaders and their ministers, the people who oversee their spiritual well-being, tell them they're doing. Very quickly, there's another theme within this preaching, or these sermons. Why is the war necessary? The moral decay of the old Union. We've got to get out. We've got to get away from these. The conservative nature of the South. God has been guiding us. He's been giving us signs all along that social relations are hierarchical. Go back to Henry Holcomb. Slavery was the right form of the right foundation for Republican government. And the South is going to, they're not just doing this for themselves. They're going to show the world that slavery is right. They wouldn't put it this way, but they're going to be the city on a hill, to use a Puritan definition of this. Let me back up just for a second on that one. Something else that they're concerned with, and another way that they're explaining why the war has to come. Sometimes, these ministers say, God punishes his people. And he has brought this war on us as a punishment for not meeting our duties as Christians. And when God takes his favor away from us, that means that he's unhappy with us as not a nation, but us as a people. And us as individual sinners. It's not a corporate issue. It's an issue of individual sin. And that's why we lose these battles. And that's why these men are being killed. That's why this violence is being visited. Yes, ma'am.
So, nowhere in the Bible does it actually black and white say this. This is an interpretation.
Yes. Yes. It's a
The
theology.
preachers we say this happens, and if we win this war, then I'm right.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
Yeah.
It's just an
Yeah, exactly.
interpretation.
Well, so you have competing theologies. There's a great book by Martin Knoll, The Civil War is a Theological Crisis. There are different ways of reading the Bible, different ways of interpreting the Bible. If we could dip deeper into some of these sermons, and we can see that articulation of this is, the North is reading the Bible wrong. They're concluding wrongly about the Bible. We are concluding rightly about the Bible, and therefore we are right. Now, guess what they don't do? Now, you're kind of jumping ahead here, but this is a great place to jump ahead. They don't change their mind when the war's over. That theology persists. That idea persists. And guess how they explain it? God is continuing to punish us as a people. Because it's kind of funny, but it's the logic of Southern religious culture.
Powerful.
It's incredibly powerful because this is what you learn from when you're a baby. This is by the time that these men are joining the Confederate Army, there have been 3 generations of this kind of thinking being taught in Sunday school, taught in sermons, modeled in churches. Those churches are beautiful places, and those churches were the site of biracial worship. Black people worshipped in the same building as the white people. But the black people got special little sermons on the side about obeying their master. Different kinds of instruction. So I don't want to go too far because I get wound up and I talk too much. So we would think that this would be an easy jump from wartime or peacetime to wartime, and it wasn't. Believe it or not, well, not believe it or not, this is not hard to believe. It's difficult to translate that sacred space, the churches, the social traditions, the ways of doing church, the not fighting a battle on Sunday, not working on Sunday. How do you translate that to a military context? That's a big problem. Difficulties created by the Confederate Congress's approach. Can you believe that the Confederacy, who is explicitly in early 1861 setting the government up as a Christian government, the Confederate Congress refuses to pay chaplains enough money and give material support to chaplains that the chaplains think is right. You see newspaper articles about it. You see sermons criticizing the Confederate Congress's short-sightedness and not providing for the spiritual needs of the soldiers. It takes until late 1861, November of 1861, I believe, before the Confederate government finally accedes to these complaints and says, okay, we'll give you a first lieutenant's pay. Because at the beginning, the first legislation that creates the chaplaincy, chaplains are going to be paid less than a second lieutenant. So if you're one of these guys who's gone to Hampton-Sydney or Union Theological Seminary or Georgia or the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Greenville, South Carolina, you're a well-trained person. You're from the upper echelons of society. That status is not going to sit well with you. And they say it. They say flat out say that. Let's see. Denominational opinions about state and church. Baptists, a lot of Baptists didn't think that the Confederate government should be paying chaplains. That it should be a private affair, that they should be sending missionaries to the army. It works a little bit, but it's just not. It doesn't. That way of organizing things doesn't meet the demands of the day. So what do chaplains do? What are the chaplains doing in once they come to the army? This is kind of overarching everything that we're going to say from here on to the end. They preach. They connect home. They go home from time to time. They take messages back home. They sometimes write letters to newspapers that are talking about the spiritual progress and the spiritual work that's going on in the camps. They distribute religious literature. By the middle of 1862, there are huge warehouses in Richmond, Virginia that are run by the Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian publication wings. And they're taking those tracts out to the soldiers in the field. They help on the battlefields, they help with medical care, and they provide that regular pastoral care that you would assume. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot level of what these guys are doing. I wanted to show you a few of the chaplains that I've looked at and studied over the course of the years. J. William Jones, you may have heard of him. He wrote a book after the war called Christ in the Camp, a super important book in thinking about what's going on in religion. I think our big thing here we need to pay attention to in all these chaplains is where did they go to school? These are not backwoods farmer preachers. These are well-trained theologians. So he goes to UVA, goes to Southern Baptist Seminary, and then becomes the chaplain of the 13th Virginia A.P. Hill's Regiment, and then becomes a missionary who covers a much larger field than just the 13th Virginia. His roommate at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary is Crawford Toy, again, a UVA graduate. Southern Baptist Seminary graduate. He and Jones graduate together, and they are planning to go to be missionaries in Japan. War crisis comes along, and they say, well, we can be missionaries here in the Army. And that's how they look at things. Best friend in Jones, one of the soldiers from the 53rd Georgia said he wasn't a very good preacher. Now, after the war, Toy goes to Berlin. Right after the war, goes to Berlin and studies a higher criticism of biblical texts, which puts him in bad standing when he comes back to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And he gets involved in this controversy about the literalism of the Bible, and he is asked to resign. He goes to Harvard, where he becomes a theology professor and becomes one of the leading Unitarians in the United States. He is the outlier of outliers. Most of these guys end up staying in the South and being very Southern. T.D. Witherspoon, this is your boy's chaplain. David, 42nd, he serves the 11th and 42nd Mississippi specifically, but Joe Davis's Mississippi and North Carolina Brigade more generally. Again, where does he go to school? He goes to the University of Mississippi. He goes to Columbia Seminary in Columbia, South Carolina, the Presbyterian's premier Southern institution. You either go to Columbia in Columbia, South Carolina, or you go to Princeton for Presbyterian. He goes to the Southern version, joins the Army as a private, and he becomes chaplain in 1861. Very few. This is one example we know for a fact because it's mentioned in his compiled service record. He actually is a fighting chaplain. He picks up a gun at Gettysburg and participates in Pickett's charge. The Hugh Miller story is a great one. If you want to, if somebody was interested in Hugh Miller, who's the colonel of the 42nd Mississippi, really interesting story there. But it takes a long time to tell. But he stays with the Army to the end. After the war's over, I'm a Confederate. I've always been a Confederate. I was a Confederate from the beginning, and I'll be a Confederate until the day I die. Unreconstructed. Some people would say he's a lost cause guy. I would say no, he's not. He's just a part of this cultural logic, this way of understanding the world that religious leaders have put forward in the years before the war and through the war. Peter Tinsley, Episcopalian, he is, I like the bit at Gettysburg. He says that this is right before Pickett's charge. He's friends with James Kemper, was with Kemper throughout his recovery. Said a short prayer, sang the doxology, and I close with the apostolic benediction. How sincere and fervent must have been the prayers. By all probability, we knew it was our last. That's just as the shelling is ending after Alexander's bombardment of the Union lines, but before the infantry moves forward. You can imagine that. Let's see. He's a really fascinating guy. He's not a Calvinist, very critical of Calvinism. Ends up in the building that I used to run at the seminary on why is that picture? That's the wrong picture. Anyway, I have a picture of J.J.D. Renfro. Renfro's an interesting guy. You can see that his father wasn't particularly religious. Study. He's one who does informal study, becomes a Baptist preacher. By 1861, though, he is a very prominent minister in northeast Alabama. He only comes to the Army in 1863, but he's a pretty important guy. I'll get back to my pictures are off. That is not Francis Milton Kennedy. That is J.J.D. Renfro. Something has happened. Renfro does a great job of documenting the everyday life of chaplains, interdenominational cooperation and such. And that's not Betts. Something has happened here. Oh, wait a minute, that is Betts. Betts is in the center. These are several chaplains from North Carolina regiments. I don't know why my things have gotten screwed up. Interesting stories at Gettysburg from Betts. He reports revival activity that had started in January, February of 1863. He reports services going on through the beginning of the Gettysburg campaign, holds a baptismal service at Funkstown, Maryland, and baptizes soldiers in Antietam Creek just about 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. So the activity is going on, that the revival enthusiasm continues through the campaign season, at least in Ramseur's brigade. James Sheeran, now I've got back to the right pictures. This is James Sheeran, 14th Louisiana. He's a Catholic. He does not like Protestants. He's not shy about saying so. The Protestant chaplains had created a chaplains association, and he and Richard Ewell were pretty tight. And Ewell continued through 1863. He's like, you need to go to the Chaplains Association. And he said, look, they're heretics. Literally says they're heretics. And he says, they're heretics, and they won't learn anything from me. They will refuse to hear me, and I have nothing to learn from them. Great diary. It's a super, super, super diary. So anyway, when does the revival start? Revival begins once everybody gets organized. It's just simple. It's kind of simple math, right? Once the chaplains, the culpritors who are giving out the literature get into the camps, once the Army missionaries get into the camps, you begin to see some organization. You also got to remember that they don't get organized until after the 1862 campaign, starting with 7 days. The Army's in the field from the end of June until September, the end of September. So there's really no time for them to begin to do the work that's going to lead to the kind of revival that these people understand until the fall of 1862. And lo and behold, things kick off in the fall of 1862. You begin to see revival, religion, more prayer meetings, more preaching, more conversions that are happening within the Army. And I think one of the things that's really important for us to keep in mind Remember, these people have an interpretive tool bag that they come to the war with. They come to the army with a way of understanding the world. And these guys had grown up in an environment where they were culturally conditioned to expect revival. Before 1820, the narrative in the churches in the South was decline, 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 decline. But with these revivals in the 1820s and 30s, and the growth of the church in the 1830s and the 1840s, the expectation was that we're going to have revival. It may take a while, but we're going to have a period of religious enthusiasm, not shouting and jumping around, but a religious affectation that's going to happen sooner or later. And in this case, it starts in the fall of 1862, and it goes through the end of the war. Now, can you imagine what these guys are thinking when they get to the camps, the winter camps, in the fall of 1862? I better get right with God. They've seen some horrible things that they could never have imagined in May of 1861 or 62. They've lived through the hell of Lee's 1862 campaigns, and this becomes a very the status of their souls becomes a very acute problem for these men. Private piety. This is again the function of the pre-war Sunday school, the pre-war ways of teaching and learning. And you begin to see the soldiers, and I like to start with the private piety of the soldiers when thinking about these revivals. This is Samuel Birney. Birney's father was the secretary of the Georgia Baptist Convention, so he's a high-level Baptist. Just before the war, Birney had graduated from Mercer College, joins Cobb's Legion Infantry, is in Cobb's Brigade, and then Wofford's Brigade through the war. He's wounded at Chancellorsville, badly wounded at Chancellorsville. But he oftentimes went off into the woods and the fields near the camps to pray. William Stillwell, the 53rd Georgia, reports the same kind of activity. You see this over and over during the winter camps. They're finding places to go and to have their own private communion with Christ. And they believe that to be that's part of their practice of piety, and they do that even within these crowded camps. Now, Stillwell is particularly interesting to me because he's a Methodist layman, and he's also the guy. Stillwell's the guy that said Crawford Toy was a terrible preacher. But Stillwell is organizing prayer meetings, and he's leading small regular services every week. His April 28th diary, the April 28, 1863 letter to his wife. So this is less than a week before the beginning of the Chancellorsville fight. He's near Fredericksburg, and he says, "I have to lead the prayer service next week. I'm going to use the 50th Psalm as my text unless something happens." Of course, we all know that that's a very important week in the life of William Stillwell and the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia. So, conversion and edification. This is the most common kind of tract that comes to the Army. It's the most common kind of preaching that you see. It's certainly the emphasis and focus of the individual prayer meetings and these private expressions of private piety. But then there's a couple of things that happened at the end of 1862 that are very important. One is the private piety. One is the issues of what's happening to our soul, what has happened. That's the white men. The chaplains are supposed to take care of the spiritual needs of the soldiers. But something else happens. We know what happens in September of 1862. Lincoln issues his first version of the Emancipation Proclamation. It says this is going into effect on January 1st, 1863. And the ministers across the South begin to organize to oppose that, to oppose it to international audiences and to the soldiers in the field. And you see sermon after sermon after sermon, starting in October of 1862, publication after publication, decrying the Emancipation Proclamation, saying that it's going to lead to the massacre of whites in the South. Really frightening stuff if you're a white plantation owner or if you're the son of a white plantation owner in Robert E. Lee's army. Our worst nightmares are about to come true. We have got to fight this out. And this message continues through the end of the war, right up to the last minute. this is the wrong image again. Renfro, J.D.D. Renfro gives a very important sermon, and we'll kind of wrap things up here, well, close to. Renfro gives an important sermon in the camps at Orange Courthouse on August 21st, 1863, after Gettysburg, after Vicksburg, after the Tullahoma campaign. The Confederates are worried that emancipation is going to happen, and then all of a sudden they get their tails handed to them at Gettysburg, they lose Vicksburg, and they lose all of Middle Tennessee. So suddenly, think about that, from the beginning of May to the end of July, gosh, not even the end of July, the middle of July, things have gone from, hey, I think we might pull this off, we might win this war, to, oh my God, everything that was important to us is gone now. All the strategically important points have been lost in the course of 2 months. And Renfro gives it, so Jefferson Davis issues a call for a fast day on August 21st, 1863. And Renfro, over here in Orange Courthouse, gives a sermon to the soldiers of Wilcox's Alabama Brigade. These are the guys who, they had been in some ugly stuff at Gettysburg. And he starts off his sermon, says, Gettysburg wasn't, the Yankees had to retreat to their mountain fortresses to beat us at Gettysburg. In a fair fight, we win. And Vicksburg's not a big deal. The Yankee Navy was up and down the river anyway. We had already lost the Mississippi before Vicksburg fell. Didn't lose 30,000 troops. You didn't mention that. What happened in Tennessee, it's bad, but it's not terrible. Now, to the guys from the 10th Alabama, where Union cavalry troops were going up and down the Tennessee River Valley and raiding their houses and destroying things, Tullahoma was a big deal. Their homes were now behind Union lines. North Alabama was behind Union lines. Then he goes on, and he goes on for about 4 pages. And he says, I've heard it said that this is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. But I stand before you as a representative of the poor man of the South. If I had a rich relative, I never knew him. And if we ever owned a slave in my family, I've never known of it. But I stand before you and say that the rich man the poor man of the South has more to gain in this war than the poor man. Because if we lose this war and the slaves are free, you will become the bootblacks of the dandies. Your fair daughters will marry the dusky sons of Ham. Your fair daughters will scrub the floors of the taverns. So you tell me, he says, is this war for the rich man of the South or the poor man of the South? It's a profound statement. And it's so profound that the Christian Index picks it up when it gets published. The sermon gets published. It's out by October of 1863. And the Christian Index, one of the largest denominational papers in the country, or in the South, recommends this as an ideal explication of the times. We heartily recommend this sermon to everyone in the Confederacy. They explain things oh so well. 1863 also sees another switch, an important transition. There's an emphasis on loyalty. This is a sermon given in Hope's Brigade in North Carolina when they're down near New Bern, trying to recapture New Bern in the beginning of 1864. They capture a bunch of Union soldiers who had been Confederate deserters, and then they hang them. 22 men are being hanged. And the chaplain of Hope's Brigade says, of all deserters and traitors, Judas Iscariot is undoubtedly the most infamous. Either sacred or profane. I hold, gentlemen, that there are few crimes in the sight of God, of either God or man, that are more wicked and detestable than desertion. These begin to be increasingly heard in the camps. Don't be a traitor. Don't be Judas. Fight it out to the end. They fight it out to the end. Some of them, many of them, a lot of them encouraged by religion, we're told. And as the war goes on, so we've had this breaking down and reshaping of the sacred spaces. But by 1863, so I'm trying to bring this back around to the post-war era. The soldiers are reconstructing those sacred spaces, and they're beginning to look towards the post-war. Camps, in the winter camps, you don't have outside services, in the Stonewall Brigade at least. You have chapels that have been built for the regular preaching, for the chaplains associations to meet, for the soldiers to have prayer meetings. They do it again in 1864. This time they break it up by three regiments, and then 2 regiments in the Pioneer Corps of the Stonewall Brigade. And they build log chapels in the middle of the camp. And these become central locations for worship services of different types. And they're also, this is very, well, shoot. Wrong button. It's also important to notice this. According to, this is from J. William Jones's book, according to this, at the very end of the war, these chapels are fully staffed with chaplains. Through most of the war, less than half of Lee's army had chaplains at all. But as the war is coming to a close, at least according to J. William Jones and his recollections, you had plenty of chaplains in the camps in the winter of 1864, 1865. It's super interesting to think about, but it sets us up for the post-war period. And I'll wrap up with this because I don't want to go into the post-war very far. First thing, the men, those guys that I showed, the chaplains, except for Crawford Tully, all become denominational leaders after the war is over. They're either editors, they're presidents of associations, they all become important leaders and teachers in the war, after the war. And none of them, except Crawford Tully, stray from the party line. They all maintain that old theology. Their minds haven't been changed by the war, they've just been chastened by God. And we've all heard the lost cause myth, right? I think in terms of the religious implications of that, I don't think it's lost cause made up trying to defend ourselves at all. It goes back to 1785. It's the cultural logic of the religious system that had been built from 1785 to 1860 that we're seeing in play in the years after the war. I think that changes the way that we see the lost cause in very important ways. It's a deep, deep, deep expression of the cultural logic of the South, not something that's made up after 1865 to explain why the South is lost. Most of them retain their loyalty. David, your guy, Witherspoon, says he's a Confederate. I've always been a Confederate. And he is a dyed-in-the-wool, I'm a good old rebel kind of guy. And he says so to the end of his life. There's a very extensive set of his papers that exist. And again, many of these men become important denominational leaders. A lot of the soldiers who we've seen, or several of the soldiers that we've seen, end up becoming preachers or leaders in the denomination. Some of the soldiers even go back home during the war and become preachers. They become ordained to go back to be chaplains. So there are a large number, I haven't figured out exactly how many, and I may never be able to, but a large number of soldiers who, through their experience in the war and through their religious practices during the war, become denominational and church leaders in the years after the war. And I think that helps us see the persistence of that system of theology, that system of understanding the world that persisted well into the 20th century in Southern religious practice and also political practice. So with that, I will end. I know I've gone a little bit long, and I apologize for that, but I fielded a few questions that took me off to begin with. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm cranked up now, so you know I grew up Southern Baptist, so I could talk all day. Thank you. All right, we'll go in order. Just your hand up first.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the revival in the South being quiet and reflective.
Yeah.
And then we have transcendentalism and the Quakers in
Yeah.
the North. Was there any cross-pollination? Have you run across any of that?
I've not seen any cross-pollination. They're going in different directions, obviously.
Right. But it's internal.
Well, it is internal, and transcendentalism comes out of Calvinism.
Right.
So that introspective mode is certainly a part of what Calvinism is. So I think that probably what you're seeing accurately, what you're accurately describing is just different expressions of that Calvinism in the old Puritan context versus the Calvinism in a new Southern Baptist context. And that's important. And it's important to remember too that the Methodists, they're Arminian in their theology. You can approach God. I mean, the basic distinction between Arminianism and Calvinism is that in Calvinism, God tells you if you're saved or not. In Arminianism, you can ask God for forgiveness and ask to be saved. You can seek salvation. The Methodists have to change their theology on conversion significantly before they become popular in the South. And many years ago, Don Matthews, who's sort of the dean of Southern Religious Studies, said, I'd given a paper at the Southern Historical Association and made some people mad, and he said, young man, don't ever forget, you're right, it's all about Calvinism in the South. I said, thank you. Thank you. I read your book really carefully. I didn't make that up, but it's been lost between 1977 and whenever this was 2006 or so. It had been kind of lost in this upswelling of democratic religious studies. That emphasis had been lost. That Calvinism had been lost. Yes, sir. You're second, and then here.
Don't compare the Union religious response to the Confederate religious response.
Well, I'll be honest. I can't do it very well because my sole focus has been on the Southern side and the Confederate side, but I can take a few stabs. First off, literalism is not just a Southern thing. It's not just a Confederate thing. There is a strong literalist tradition in the northern churches, especially in the Midwest. And once you get outside of New England, where there's been a very important shift away from Calvinism, even within the Presbyterian church and the Congregational church. You got the new side and the old side, old light, new light. There are divisions over Calvinism that are happening in the churches in the north at the time. And they're softening that theology. They're moving towards an Arminian approach to salvation. The revivals that happen in the north are very different than the ones that happen in the south. They do have those emotional outbursts because the emphasis of the revivals in the north focus on that searing, immediate conversion experience. And that's a very different thing than Jesse Mercer and the Baptists struck with the profoundest silence. And so you do see, and you see James Bradison Finney's the most famous of the revival preachers in the 1840s and 50s, and he has these huge meetings in big cities, Boston and New York and Philadelphia, and then the burned over district of New York where the Erie Canal goes. There's a lot of revivalism that's going on there, but it's all very innovative. That's where the Mormons come from. That's where some of your perfectionist Methodists come from, where you get this real emphasis on changing the world. So the millennialism is different as well. The millennialism of the North has to do with perfecting the world before Christ returns. And that's why you get abolitionism, that's why you get the women's rights movement, that's why you get the temperance movement. Now, a lot of Southerners agree with the temperance movement, but the other two, they absolutely skewer it at every opportunity. So the development theologically, and then how that theology is played out into the ways that people practice their everyday lives is very different. But there are also very literalist strongholds in the North, and some pro-slavery theology in the North. And this is basic. This is what I'm saying right now is basically Mark Knoll and Richard Johnson's book on the revivals in Rochester, New York. But if you really want a good contrast between the two, read Mark Knoll's The Civil Wars of Theological Crisis, because he does it a lot better than I can. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you had mentioned that the Baptist and the Methodist had their own tracts. Did
yes,
the
ma'am.
Presbyterians?
Yes, they did. Now, if I didn't mention that, I failed to accurately describe things, because there are a lot of Presbyterian tracts that are out there, and they're really interesting things about how to pray and how to pray correctly, and how do you deal with the sin in the camps. A lot of the literature that you're seeing is very much focused at those practical levels, and the Presbyterians are really good at that. They really are good about the discipline, at least the ones that exist, the ones that we know of. Very good about focusing on that discipline. and about how to practice being a better Christian in the camps. And that's a lot of what they do. Yes, sir.
I've heard dozens like this is the best. Right now,
Thank you.
in the state of Florida,
Yep.
the two black scholars, and they're picking on that. The TV series Roots
Yeah.
showed that they learned trades.
Yeah.
Kunta Kinte was a slave in
Yeah.
Spotsylvania.
Yeah.
The Waller. I mean, we don't know our history. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
This is what you need to know.
Thank you. I think I'll probably get right out of the word in front of us. Yes, sir.
Would it be too strong a statement to make that Christianity, as the Southerners understood it, caused war?
No. I don't think that's accurate. Well, I think the disjunction between the Northern theology and the Southern theology, because both are changing. Both are changing. In the Federal period, in the early Republic, there's a lot of cooperation between the Northern and the Southern branches. Now, as slavery becomes an increasingly important part of Southern life and a dominant part in a lot of places, that theology begins to change. But Northern theology begins to change too. It started to change at the end of the Revolution, moving in an abolitionist direction. But both are diverging from what they had shared before. Now, I would agree that the Southerners' vehemence in defending slavery through the Bible created an unbridgeable gap between the two people, between the Southerners and Northerners. And a lot of people noticed that in 1845. They said, "My God, if we can't get along religiously and theologically, there's no way that the political union is going to hold together for much longer." These divides are really a bellwether, the canary in the coal mine. They're saying that they're showing us that this is going to split sooner rather than later. That's 1844 and 1845. So it's that hard defense of slavery that's both this political and theological that raises the temperature. But there are William Lloyd Garrison is saying, if the Bible says that slavery is right, then I'm all for getting rid of the Bible. And he also says that the Constitution is a compact with the devil because it had allowed slavery to persist. So there are extremes that are really getting people's blood boiling. But maybe I'll come back. Maybe I'll come back and say probably yes to your question. Probably yes. That's. My first impulse is to say no because the Southerners are holding on to the traditional way of interpreting the Bible and being Christian that had been shared early on. I think they're more vehement and they certainly pushed the division in 1844 and 1845. So I'll revise my earlier answer and say probably yes.
Wow.
Yes, sir.
Just one more quick one. The Protestant leaders in the states the slave states that stayed in the Union.
Yeah.
Not as effective or not as widespread.
The slave system is not as central to the mode of production, to use a Marxian way of understanding things. It's not the primary way that people are making money in Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. So the political stakes and the economic stakes aren't as high. Remember, the richest states in the country are South Carolina and Mississippi in 1860. And that's because of slavery. It was because of the product of the production of cotton and the sale of cotton on international markets. But when you get into air, so they had a lot to lose. I mean, we were talking about this before we started. If you grow up in this system, that's truth. If you grow up as a Southerner in these churches, that's truth, and you're going to be willing to go out and fight and die for that. If you grow up thinking that there's some sort of Henry Clay moderate way of doing things, then you're going to have a different response. But in Kentucky, for example, and that's the largest of the so-called border states, Kentucky has that pro-slavery theology. They have plenty of preachers preaching it. But when the war comes, the politics of secession don't fit with where Kentucky sees itself nationally and economically. But when emancipation becomes a war aim of the Lincoln administration, Kentuckians say, this ain't what we signed up for. And you can look at the Army of the Cumberland, and the largest contingent of Confederate or Union soldiers in the Army of the Cumberland are Kentuckians. Lots of Kentuckians in blue in the Army of the Cumberland, and their officers say, we're resigning. They threaten to resign en masse because of the Emancipation Proclamation. They said, this is not, and so Kentucky, my friend Patrick Lewis has written a really great book about a guy named Benjamin Buckner, one of the Buckner family. He's a Unionist, but then becomes very Confederate after the war. There's a weird thing that happens in Kentucky after the war, is that they become very Confederate in their outlook on the world. And Patrick's book's a really great explication of how that happens. And it's economic, primarily. It's economic. That they make the decisions they do in 1861, 62, 63. They protest in 1863, and then when the war's over, they say, we don't like emancipation. We don't like the end of slavery at all. And it's a fascinating thing. And then their ministers become a little bit more outspoken as well. But there are different traditions up there too. I mean, you've got more Presbyterians. It's a little bit more of a diverse. I mean, one of the things that we need to know, looking at my data set, these armies mostly Baptist and Methodist, overwhelmingly Baptist and Methodist. There's not a whole lot of, there's not a single county in Lee's army that had a majority of Lutherans. In Kentucky, you're seeing a very different pattern because of the immigration patterns. They're different. Kentucky's a different place. Maryland, it's a very similar kind of pattern. It's an economic thing that keeps the state in the union. But you do have lots of very loud in Baltimore on the Eastern Shore, very strong pro-slavery theologians and preachers preaching there. And it makes sense, right? That's where that fits. It doesn't fit in Hagerstown. In Western Maryland, it doesn't fit. The religious expression has to fit with the society in which it exists. It has to serve some purpose within that larger society for it to fit. And I think that's something that's very important to think about American religious history in general. It has this. I hope I don't step on any theological or religious toes here, but I think it's clear looking at this that the questions have already been asked. This is a mutable system. The way that you understand the Bible depends. It depends on where you stand. The most important thing I learned from Dixon Bruce, my dissertation advisor, it depends on where you're standing as to how this looks. Where are you standing at the time historically, and where are you standing as a historian? How are you seeing these issues? It depends.
Amen.
All right.
That's really
I feel like I've been at a PhD summary, and this is excellent, and has, I think, opened many of our minds to maybe look into this even more. So thank you very much, Dr. Black, and thank you all for coming today. Please come again next month, okay? And also pay attention to our website. We will be able to post our at least a portion of our 2024 program listings probably at the end of September. We're working on it. We have three months booked for next year, and so we're trying to fill in the rest. So thank you very much. Go out and keep cool, okay? Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.